You're watching FJTN, the Federal Judicial Television Network. Live from the Federal Judiciary's studios in Washington, D.C., the Federal Judicial Center presents Supervising Defendants and Offenders with Mental Disorders, Part 2.
Hi, welcome. I'm Bob Luke, Training Specialist with the FJC, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Part 2 of our program, Supervising Defendants and Offenders with Mental Disorders. Last week, as you recall, we talked about mental illnesses, their causes, treatments, therapies, medications, by way of a little bit of background to getting into your role as officers. Today, we're going to be talking more directly about your role as we talk about how to identify and interview those who may have mental disorders. And in the third week of the program, we'll be getting into some specific supervision issues. As always, you can send us a fax here in the studio. I hope you do that. We do like to hear from you, and I hope you don't, but if by any chance you do have technical difficulties during the program, please call the number that you see on your screen now. And now, it is my pleasure once again to welcome Miggy Bayerga. Miggy, as many of you know, is the Mental Health Administrator for the Office of Probation and Pretrial Services. Miggy will be with us during today's broadcast, and thanks for coming, and let me turn the program over to you now, Miggy.
Thank you, Bob, and welcome to all of you joining us today. We're glad you could be with us. Today, we will be actually putting theory into practice. That's right. This is where the rubber meets the road. We will be discussing how and where officers can go to identify whether a person has a history of mental illness. We will be sharing places you can look for, go to as far as records and all that to identify whether somebody has a mental health history. Mastering these skills are important in that they will help you, the officer having to do this, in identifying whether or not you need to refer the person for an evaluation, and it will also help you in determining whether you should recommend a treatment condition, a mental health treatment condition. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our instructors for this afternoon, and they are Mark Embler, Dr. Embler, I might add. He's a United States probation officer in the District of South Carolina. Mark has a master's in social work and has a great deal of experience in the area of mental health, having had his own private practice and having worked in a psychiatric hospital for several years. Our second instructor is Tom Larson. Tom is a supervising U.S. probation officer in the District of New Jersey, my former district. And Tom comes to us also with a great deal of mental health experience, being a licensed clinical social worker and having worked as a mental health treatment specialist for several years. Before I turn it over to our instructors, I'd like to remind you that I will be available for questions. And now I turn it over to Mark Embler, and enjoy the program. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Miggy, and thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully, we're going to talk about some things that's going to assist you as officers in the field with mentally disordered offenders. And last week, as Bob mentioned, we discussed primarily several types of mental illnesses. Also, we talked about the behaviors associated with each of these, as well as the causes and the usual treatments, including the medications and therapy used. Today, what our focus is going to be is how you as an officer can use that information to identify individuals who possibly have a mental disorder. Okay? Identification of mentally disordered offenders is critical, primarily because mental health can become a management issue. Especially, we're talking about three things here: when assessing risk, danger of non-appearance, and thirdly, compliance with conditions of release and probation. Some mentally disordered offenders come to us with a prior diagnosis of a mental illness. And in that case, you know the person suffering from, let's say, a bipolar disorder, depression, or even possibly schizophrenia. And in those cases, you can plan your supervision and your investigation accordingly. However, some clients come to us that do not have a previously diagnosed mental illness. In those instances, it falls to us as officers to identify at least identify an individual with a potential mental disorder, and at that point make a referral to either possibly your mental health specialist there in your district or even a professional, a clinician, to make that diagnosis. And let me stress here that identification is somewhat different, is actually different as a clinical diagnosis. And we're going to use the term identification today to mean detecting individuals and recognizing, say, behaviors or statements that are made with a possible mental disorder. And at that point, then we can make the necessary referral to obtain that diagnosis. Okay, we're going to be using the participant guide quite a bit today. So if you have that with you, go ahead and turn to page 19 as we get started. And let's look at the objectives. What do we want to accomplish today in this program? Okay, first, we want to identify indicators and documentation that suggest individuals may have a mental disorder. Also, we want to learn how to conduct interviews to identify individuals with mental disorders. Thirdly, how to identify behavioral clues during interviews that may indicate individuals have mental health disorders. Also want to know how to use collateral contacts to help identify individuals with mental disorders. And finally, how to use mental health treatment conditions appropriately. And next week, we're going to be looking at the referral process and the unique supervision challenges that you might expect from individuals with mental disorders and ways that you're going to be able to meet those challenges. Today, we're looking at identification criteria. And to do that, let's, according to the Administrative Office in the Guide to Judicial Policies and Procedures, particularly that's in Volume 10, Chapter 11, an offender is identified as mentally disordered if they meet one or more of the four following criteria. And let's go over these criteria. Okay? If they exhibit extreme behavior and thinking that is bizarre or dangerous to self and others. Examples of this may be auditory or, let's say, visual hallucinations, paranoid thinking, excessive spending, manic episodes, or self-mutilation. Another criteria is that they verbalize suicidal ideation, or they have feelings of depression or other symptoms of a mental disorder. Thirdly, a criteria is that they have a history of psychiatric problems or have taken psychotropic medications as documented in various reports and records, or even have past suicidal attempts or gestures. And the last one is they have been arrested or committed an offense that supports a suspicion that the offender has a mental health disorder. Okay, so it's these criteria that you're going to be looking for as an officer to determine whether or not a person needs to be referred for the possibility of a mental health disorder diagnosis. There's four basic methods that we're going to be looking at to make an identification of one of these criteria. What do you need to look at? Four areas. Number one is to review records and reports. Secondly, interviewing the individual. Thirdly, observe the individual's behavior. And finally, interviewing collateral contacts. Okay, these are our four areas or methods of identification. What we're going to do today is talk about each one of these separately. And let's start with records and reports. I'm going to give you 1 minute, and in this minute, this is on page 20 in your participant guide, I want you to list records and reports, any that you can think of that you think would be valuable. When we come back from this minute, I'll go over the list that we have here. Okay, I know that minute goes by fairly quickly, but let's see what we've come up with. Now, I'm going to share a list that was developed by the planning committee here for this program. And all the lists that we use today were developed by this planning committee. And they're used as, they're illustrative. They're not exhaustive. In other words, there's several things that I'm sure you can add to the list, but these are some of the main ones that we want to look at. Okay, what kind of records are we going to look at? You can look at arrest records at either a federal, state, or a county level, Bureau of Prisons records, court records such as, let's say, the prosecutor's report or request for competency to stand trial evaluations, employment records, medical records, and especially if they have any psychiatric reports. Also military records, pretrial services or pre-sentence investigation reports that we have right there available to us. Also school records. Okay, again, there's others that I'm sure you've added to the list as well. All right, you have these reports and records available to you. Now, what do you do with them? What do you look at? What are you trying to find as far as mental disorders? Okay, I'm going to give you another minute to do this. You've got these reports and records, and we are on page 20 now of your participant guide. What in these records are you going to look for? 1 minute, okay, and then we'll talk about these. Okay, welcome back. I want to just talk about maybe 3 of the very obvious things in these records that you're going to look for. Things that sort of jump off the page that you recognize this person more than likely has a mental disorder if you see these things. One is a previous diagnosis of a mental disorder. This is particularly true if you see the person has had a hospitalization for a mental illness. Another one may be the use of any psychotropic medications. I know last week in the lesson you talked about psychotropic medications, and there's actually a list of these in your participant guides. And that's one reason you may want to hold on to these guides so that you can refer back to some things in there. And as you discussed, a lot of these medications are used to treat mental disorders. And another one that'll jump off the page at you is referrals to a mental health professional for an emotional disorder and a mental health treatment plan. All right, those are obvious. Those are the ones that, as you're looking at the records, you're pretty sure that there's probably a mental disorder, at least enough to go on that you need to search further. The less obvious pieces are documented incidents that indicate 3 things. They indicate instability, some type of aberrant behavior, or an inability to function appropriately in society. And again, recall the discussion last week about personality disorders. And personality disorders, remember, exist when maladaptive or inflexible personality traits are pervasive. They're common and they run as a thread through the individual's entire life. It's something that's just been there their entire life, and it impacts all of their activities and their relationships. So what we need to think about is individual incidents of instability, of these aberrant behaviors and inability to function appropriately in society. Your objective when reviewing the records and reports, it's very important that you look for red flags of these behaviors. And I'll talk about red flags a couple of times, but when we're taking notes and you see something a little bit out of the ordinary, make a note of that and use it as a red flag to form a pattern of behaviors. It's not necessarily, again, the presence of, say, one incident of something happening, but it's, again, something happens several times and there's that pattern. And at that point, there's a possibility that it could indicate a mental disorder. Okay, let's look at some of these other records, some things that you can look at that maybe are not so prevalent, that don't jump off at the page at you. How about military discharges? A lot of times when we're researching documents, we find a dishonorable discharge or some other type of discharge, and we may need to dig further and find out, well, what happened? Was it some type of a mental disorder or a mental problem? Job changes. If a person leaves jobs a lot or either for unusual reasons. Another one is we have offenders and defendants that move quite often. and you don't know why. Is it because they can't get along with others? Is it that they can't pay the rent? They're having financial problems, maybe due to gambling or some other problem. Also, one I really want to focus on is past or present offenses indicating some instability. Now, what I want you to do now is think about that. We get those rap sheets and we're looking at them, and you may see a pattern there of some sort. Take another minute and jot down, again, we are still on page 20, jot down what offenses, what charges would you look for that might indicate a mental disorder. Okay, welcome back, and here's our list. Aggravated assault charge or a conviction. And again, sometimes you're not only looking at convictions, you're also looking at charges as well, and then we can get the incident reports and find out a little more. A murder charge, very important. One that we see quite often is sex offenses, and especially if there's a pattern of these. Threatening communications. Let's say, for example, they're stalking someone, or say writing threatening letters to a judge or to a probation officer or another court employee. Credit card fraud, which may indicate a manic episode. And as I mentioned earlier, gambling can also be one. And I want to mention too that records can be a very rich source of information, but don't rely solely on records. Whenever possible, you want to find out get out as much other information as possible. And here's the reason why. Sometimes records, the problem with them is we have fewer records to work with. Also, sometimes we have insufficient time to gather information. Think of a pretrial services officer that has to get a report to a judge in a short amount of time. Also, sometimes we can't find documentation which actually indicates a mental disorder in the records that we do have to review. Occasionally, individuals come to us that have no documentation. There's no indication that there's ever been any mental instability or any problems. Let me just give you an example. There was a pretrial services officer in Maryland that was assigned a case of an individual who was walking around the Naval Academy in Annapolis with several guns and ammunition in his pockets. During the pretrial interview, the individual didn't remember walking around in this dazed, confused state, didn't know why they actually had the guns or ammunition. There's one of those red flags to that officer, and fortunately, he was referred to a professional for a mental health diagnosis. That's an example of sometimes we don't know. There's no records, there's nothing to support it. Family members don't give us any information, but there still could be a mental disability there. Okay. One thing too, always keep an eye out during interviews for possible behaviors, possible statements they make that there could be a problem. And at that point, you want to discuss it with somebody, your supervisor, your mental health specialist there in your district, or some other clinician in the mental health field. The interview is a very important topic, and I'm going to turn Tom, if you will, talk about this section for us.
Thank you, Mark. And one of the good things about my presentation is about 2/3 of the way through, we're going to have a 10-minute break. But let's talk about the interview, a very important source of information. Interviews allow you to do a couple of things. They allow you to listen for information and noting it, and they allow you to observe behavior. Let's talk about the types of questions we're going to ask and how we ask them. We need to consider that when we ask questions about family, physical and mental health, substance abuse, finances and employment, not only do we get the needed information, but we find out information that keys us into the person's mood, affective state, coping skills, and an assessment of any third-party risk if need be. Please turn to page 21 of your program guide. Let's look at the question where we ask the family, has anybody in your family ever been referred to or treated by a psychologist, counselor, or social worker? It's very important to obtain a family history of any mental health concerns. You also might ask, with regard to the physical health section, has anybody in your family or have you ever been prescribed medication, and have you ever stopped taking that medication, and do you remember what it was? When you're stressed, do you drink to help yourself sleep? Questions that we can ask in the financial portion of the investigation. Do you ever go on spending sprees and buy things that you really don't need? This could be indicative of a manic episode. We can also ask questions about criminal history that will uncover violence or prior aggressive acts, and we need to focus on the discrepancy possibly between what the offender-defendant is telling us and what's in the arrest report. Particularly true for pretrial services officers, we need to keep in mind that we do not provide a Miranda warning for offenders, defendants. And people do have the right not to comment on something, on a particular offense, and we need to honor that. Now that we've talked about the questions to ask, let's talk about how to ask them, and let's look at some key tips, all right, in questioning. Making appropriate use of open and closed-ended questions, minimizing an individual's defensiveness, and dealing directly with such sensitive topics as homicide, suicide, or hallucinations. Let's start with open and closed-ended questions. A closed-ended question is a question that requires a yes or no answer. Have you ever been to a hospital? If the person responds no, you can move on to another question. If they respond yes, an example of an open-ended question would be, could you describe what that experience was like? Minimizing defensiveness, another key technique in doing a successful interview, particularly with somebody that has a mental illness. Oftentimes, if defendants feel that you think they've got a mental illness, they will become angry, defensive, and possibly threaten harm to themselves or to you. And there's some good ways we can deal with that. The first way we can do that is explain the purpose of the report, the purpose of the interview. Why are you asking the question? For instance, this is a pretrial report that the court will receive, a pre-sentence report, and the more thorough you are in providing physical and mental health information, the better program I can develop, better bail report I can write, the better pre-sentence report I can write, and can help you determine services that you might need. Another key way to minimize defensiveness is to ask subtle questions. Oftentimes, if we ask a person directly, are they depressed? They will become angry or confused because they don't know what that means. If we ask them questions that would pertain to behaviors that indicate depression, such as, how have you been sleeping? What has your appetite been like? In the last 2 weeks, what has your energy level been like? What is your level of concentration? These are all behaviors that describe somebody that is depressed. And people have a much easier time describing behaviors than describing a technical term for an illness. And thirdly, we need to deal directly with sensitive topics like hallucinations, suicide, and homicidal ideation. This is an area that many people are not comfortable with, they're certainly not experienced with. Some people feel that if they talk to somebody about suicide, that they might induce them to do that. Research shows us quite the contrary. The more well thought out the plan, the more likely the person is to act on it. And if you, as an pretrial services officer, probation officer, can discuss in a very calm and business-like tone, what plans have you made to kill yourself, and how have you done so in the past, you won't induce suicide. Rather, I think you'll put the person more at ease as they feel some freedom, at least, to discuss this plan. Dealing directly with hallucinations is another very important part of our job. Some questions you might want to ask that would pertain to that are, do you hear sounds that others don't? Do you feel that bugs are crawling up? Do you have visions of ghosts that others don't see? An example of a tactile hallucination. Do you ever hear voices that others don't, and what are they telling you to do? If they're telling you to harm yourself or someone else, an example of command hallucinations. There's other communication techniques that we'll use, and we'll look at them in a few minutes. Right now, we're going to look at an interview of a pretrial services officer. This officer, like so many pretrial services officers, is very rushed for time. All they've been able to do in this particular case is conduct a records check. The defendant has been arrested for selling 10 ounces of cocaine to an undercover officer, and is in the marshal's lockup. And let's look at some of the techniques this officer uses in what I feel is a rather successful interview.
Okay, Mr. Dean. Now we come to the physical and the mental health portion of the interview. I'd like to start with a few questions about your physical health. How would you describe your physical health?
Very good. I don't have any problems.
Have you seen a doctor in the past year?
No.
Are you taking any medications?
No.
Taking any medications in the past 5 years?
I was taking a pill 2 years ago.
Can you tell me what it was and why you were taking it?
It was Prozac. I was taking it because I was feeling kind of low energy, and
Okay. Who prescribed it?
my doctor.
Why did your doctor prescribe it?
Why all these questions about one little pill? What do they have to do with anything?
It's a good question, Mr. Dean. I can appreciate that it's a sensitive topic, but the more I can learn about you and your situation, including your health, the better I can help you while you're in the court system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess.
See, part of my job is making recommendations to the judge that are in your best interest. And if you choose not to tell me things, that can limit my ability to do that. That's why I want to talk with you about your physical and your mental health and any problems you may have now or even had in the past. Okay?
Okay, I can see that. I'm just afraid it won't look good.
Look, whatever you tell me will just be used to see if we can come up with a set of conditions to address the issues that you may have. Can you tell me a little more about when you were taking the Prozac?
Okay. If you must know, he prescribed it for me after I left Fairfax Hospital. But it was only for a few weeks. It made me sleepy. I guess you want to know why I was at Fairfax Hospital. I just wasn't feeling all that hot. They called it depression. They kept me in there for 5 days, and then they let me go. It really wasn't that big a deal.
It may not have been, but it would still be helpful for me to know about your experience in the hospital. Why did you go into the hospital?
If you must know, I tried to commit suicide. They can go ahead and think I'm crazy just like everyone else.
Trying to commit suicide doesn't make you crazy. Look, Mr. Dean, it's obviously uncomfortable for you to talk about this, and I can understand why. But the information really is helpful to me. What happened?
I had a string of bad luck, I guess. I had a lot of bills I couldn't pay. I like to play the numbers more than I should. I lost my job at the dry cleaners. I never could get along with my boss. He got it in his head that I was lazy, and I couldn't do anything to please him. And then to top it all off, my girlfriend kept threatening to leave.
It must have been a bad time. How did you attempt your suicide?
One day, after my girlfriend left for work, I dumped a bottle of her sleeping pills into a glass of Coke. Next thing I knew, I was in a hospital bed.
What did they do for you in the hospital?
Nothing. They just sent me home with a bottle of pills.
Did they suggest that you follow up with your doctor?
No.
Have you tried to hurt yourself again?
No. That was the only time.
No more hospitalizations?
No. That's it.
Do you remember the name of the doctor that treated you at Fairfax Hospital?
It was Dr. Jackson. I think Glenn Jackson.
Okay. And he prescribed the Prozac?
Yeah.
Would you mind signing a release of information to authorize me to talk to Dr. Jackson and the staff at Fairfax Hospital?
Okay. Let me see it.
Thanks. I have just a couple more health questions to ask you before we wrap up. How's your appetite been these last several months?
Well, recently it comes and goes. I've had so much on my mind lately, what with trying to make ends meet, and my girlfriend leaving. She finally did leave. I just haven't really been that hungry. I go to the 7-Eleven for a bite sometimes.
And how are you sleeping?
Not that well. Before my girlfriend left, I was fine, but now I have trouble getting to sleep. Sometimes I wake up and just lay there.
Sounds like you've had a hard time. We may find there are other issues down the road we need to address, but for now, we're done with this part of the interview. Thanks for your cooperation.
Officer did some pretty good things in this interview. He made appropriate use of open and closed-ended questions. He dealt directly with the topic of suicide. He explained the relevancy of the questions when the defendant asked. He enlisted the defendant's support and cooperation in getting the release signed, and he thanked the person for his cooperation at the end of the interview. We're quickly going to look at a second interview. This is a pre-sentence interview. Now, at this point, the officer has had an opportunity to not only conduct a records check, but to do a collateral interview, and has a little more information than we would in a pretrial services interview. The case in question here, the offender has been arrested for assaulting he's pled guilty to assaulting a Veterans Administration officer. He has a discharge from the service of a medical discharge. He is single. He lives at home with his mother, and he has been accused of his boss of stealing. So let's take a look at this one.
Now we come to the mental health portion of the report. Mr. Walker, I believe you said you had no mental health problems. I'd like to review that.
No. I've never been to one of those types of doctors before.
Okay, let's talk about your military record. It says here that you went to the Army after high school and you were discharged a year later. Can you tell me about that?
It was harder than I thought. It really stressed me out, especially the way my drill sergeant was always picking on me. They didn't think I was cut out for it, so they let me out.
It says here that you had a medical discharge. Can you tell me about the medical problems you were having?
Like I said, they were always picking on me, like all the time. So it really stressed me out. So they let me go to the hospital, you know, so I could relax.
Did they give you any medicine?
Something for my nerves. But I don't take that anymore.
Do you remember what that was?
Just a white pill.
Okay, that's fine. Any other times when you got stressed out and went to the hospital?
My mother wanted me to go when I first got discharged, but I didn't. I just needed to get home. But she finally made me go to the VA and see what happens.
And you're living at home now, right?
That's right. With my mother.
And you're not working?
No. I used to have a job at the ice cream shop, but my boss kept saying I was stealing stuff, and I don't have to put up with that.
Any other jobs?
No, I don't like being around people much.
How come?
They're always looking at me funny. And sometimes they say things.
What kind of things?
I don't know. Just things. Different things.
Has this always been the case? That people seem to be watching you?
No. It started when I came out the Army. That's when they got my number.
Who are they?
Something to do with national security. That much I've figured out. But they got the wrong guy.
Can you tell me anything else about that?
That's all I know.
So, when you're at home, do you still feel stressed out sometimes?
Sometimes. Like when my mother's yelling at me to get a job or to get out the house. She just doesn't know how it is.
Okay, Mr. Walker. I want to ask you about something else. On your charge here, it says that you assaulted someone at the VA. Tell me about that.
Security guard. He kept looking at me. And I told him to stop, but he didn't listen. So I pushed him. You know, like to get his attention. That's when they charged me with assault. I swear I didn't hit him. I just want him to stop looking at me.
Okay. That helps me understand the charge. One other thing. It sounds like people have been really hard on you recently. And that was part of why you were so stressed out. When you were taking the white pill, did it seem like people weren't picking on you as much then?
Sometimes. More than anything, it just helped me relax.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks for telling me all that. It's very helpful to me.
Look at how the officer used the facts that she had gleaned from other reports. She did not make any accusations or interpretations, and as a result, he cooperated with her. He did not become upset or violent, and she got the information that she needed. Before we get to communication techniques, which is the next part of the program, let's take a 10-minute break. We're back. Let's talk about communication techniques. These are techniques that you'll be able to use during home visits, office visits, and telephone contacts with defendants, offenders. And you'll find them on page 23 of your program guide. First, avoid passing judgment. Listen to what the offender is telling you. Don't yell, scream if somebody tells you something that doesn't make any sense to you. Just note what they're telling you. If a person tells you that they're hearing voices, just ask, what are the voices telling you? Second thing, be persistent. If you don't understand the response to a question that you asked, just ask it again. You might want to say to someone, look, maybe I wasn't very clear about that one. Let me repeat it again. Or I didn't quite get that answer. Let's go back to that. Third thing, remain calm. Don't argue. Sometimes we get uncomfortable in interviewing individuals that are mentally ill. The last interview was an example of someone that may or may not have been responding to voices inside his head. What we don't need to do is argue or confront someone in a situation like that for a couple of reasons. First, if a person has a fixed belief, a delusion, not based in reality, something like they believe they're Captain Kirk of the Enterprise, first of all, you're not going to convince them otherwise. Secondly, to argue with them, confront them on that might make them upset, angry, act out against you, or act out against themselves. What you can use that for is an opportunity to note the information, note their coping skills, note the mental state, note the voices, and note that in your report. One thing that we saw in those interviews, particularly in the last one, is that after offenders, defendants shared certain information, the pretrial services pre-sentence officer thanked the individual for doing that. Some of the information people tell us is information that they've never related to anybody before, very sensitive information. And I think they should be encouraged and thanked for sharing such. The fourth technique that we look at is listening with the third ear. By that we mean listening to what someone is saying, how they describe certain incidents, emotions they display. Also listening to what is not said, listening to the silence, very important thing to do. Look at certain topics that they won't talk about. An individual might spend 5 minutes talking about a particular parent and nothing about the other parent. You need to be thorough, look through that, ask specific questions, but note what they gave emphasis to and what they did not emphasize. Last but not least, don't play doctor. You're not a trained psychiatrist. You're not a psychologist. You are a pretrial services officer. You are a probation officer. All right? An example of this might be a defendant offender who says, do you think I'm crazy? And a response would be to say, obviously what you're telling me, you're somewhat anxious. You've got a concern about your behavior. More to the point, what do you think, and how can we help you with that? I'd like to conclude this section on communication techniques by noting that the more that you use these, the more comfortable you're going to become with them, and the better information you will receive for your pretrial supervision report, your pre-sentence report, the probation supervised release supervision plan you devise, and the implementation of your supervision. And last but not least, if you've got certain concerns about working with this population, not uncommon, talk about this with your supervisor or the mental health specialist. Observations. This is another way that we can observe individuals that may or may not have a mental health disorder. Your participant guide on page 24 lists speech, behavior, and aspects of physical appearance that might serve as red flags for an individual with a mental illness. Let's look at speech indicators. Number one, a rapid rate of speech could be indicative of a manic episode that we see with bipolars. 2, flight of ideas, loose associations, ideas that don't make sense in reference to one or another. And 3, unusual comments. For instance, an individual that tells you that we have to really terminate this interview in 5 minutes because the president is coming to town and he's going to make me the Secretary of State. Another area would be behavioral indicators, and these would be such things as inappropriate affect, a person whose affect might be laughing when they're describing an assault that they suffered, something we call mood congruency. Hallucinatory responses, the individual who during the interview may be laughing out loud, looking over your shoulder to see if someone's there, or talking in a low voice like we saw the last person at one point during the interview. Excessive agitation, nervousness that somebody might display, an inability to sit down, fidgeting, jingling coins in your pocket. And finally, a marked change in energy. An example of this would be a person that would come into an interview feeling energetic and midway through start crying. You notice a low level of energy. And finally, physical appearance. A marked change in physical appearance can be indicative of a mental health disorder. Hygiene, the individual that has not washed, has not shaved, the clothes are disheveled, they haven't brushed teeth, they haven't bathed, a good indicator. Health, evidence of weight loss, significant weight gain, complaints of insomnia, or other somatic complaints. We've covered 3 of the 4 methods used in the identification process. We've reviewed records, we've conducted interviews, and we've observed behaviors. And now I turn you over to Mark with the 4th very important component, and that is collateral contacts.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Again, this is the last method of identification we're going to discuss today. And as you know, as officers of the court, collateral contacts are, of course, used to supplement and also to verify information that you've obtained during the interview. And it's going to help you develop a picture of the individual, particularly in 3 different areas. You're going to be able to look at their lifestyle, the idiosyncrasies, as well as their various behaviors. You can discover under what circumstances this individual may act out. You can look for those, what I like to call warning signs, that will indicate a potential problem. Also, for disorders that are treated by therapy, you're going to be able to use collateral contacts to let you know how that person is doing in therapy. Are they attending, and are they making progress? We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. In your participant guide on page 25, there's several collateral contacts listed there. Let's take a look now at what the potential mental disorders that you're going to try to obtain from these collateral contacts. All right, so if you'll turn there at this point, what I want you to do is to look at that list and we're going to take 5 minutes here. You can do this individually, you can do it with a partner, or you can even do it with the group there. And look at what you want to acquire from each one of these collateral contacts. So let's take 5 minutes and then we'll go over our list here. Okay, we're back. And I'm going to go over our list, which you can find in your participant guide on page 26. And let's go over these together. Okay, one of the first things is ask the family, friends, or minister about the individual's behavior, possible hospitalizations, any medications, diagnosis, and response to treatment, spending habits, their social relationships, any disruptive or possible violent behavior, either in the present or even in the past as well, criminal activity, drug or alcohol abuse, feelings and threats of suicide. Another one is if the individual is working and you know their employer, talk to them and ask if number one, are they aware they're on supervision, and ask the employer about their work habits, their work performance, their ability to work with others. Family doctors. We can ask a family doctor about prescriptions. A lot of times we see that even if a person is not involved in treatment, they're being prescribed some of these psychotropic medications. Also, you can ask family doctors about other mental health concerns and possibly even some of the physical health concerns. If the individual is on supervised release, ask the Bureau of Prisons case manager for the most recent assessment and evaluations. A lot of times we don't obtain all the information that we can from the BOP. Also possibly talk about if they were in treatment, any medication regimes, and any treatment plans or prognosis. If the person is in treatment, of course, that's going to be one of your main collateral contacts with that treatment provider. Ask about the diagnosis, current and past medications, progress toward treatment goals. I mean, are they progressing? What is that treatment plan? Have you gone over that treatment plan with the provider? What are the goals? And are they making progress? Another very important contact with that treatment provider, you want to have a good relationship and make sure they're letting you know about attendance. If there's any missed appointments, you're going to need to know that so that you can discuss it with the offender or defendant and find out what the problem is. Why didn't they attend? And are they having more problems? Okay. Another one, ask the victim. Can you talk to the victim about the crime? Make that contact. A lot of times we don't pursue that. What did the individual say during the commission of the crime? How did the individual act? And lastly, we can talk to neighbors about any suspicious activities. What guests does this person have coming over? If you ask some of these questions, it could lead to more information about possible even, let's say, cult activities, drug use activities, or casual sex partners. There's two things I want to caution you on when talking with these collateral contacts. One, we cannot disclose any more pretrial, pre-sentence, or even supervision information that is absolutely necessary to obtain the information that we're looking for. Even if you identify yourself as a federal officer, you show your credentials, and you tell them the person is under supervision, we can only disclose enough information to elicit the information that you're looking for. And secondly, and possibly even more importantly, we cannot disclose any information or reveal anything about drug aftercare. That is something we can't do, and it could actually subject us to possible criminal penalties. So that's a real caution there. Okay, we've looked at all four areas in the identification process today. We've looked at reviewing records. We talked about interviewing the individual and what to ask during that interview. We talked about noting observations, both physical, behavioral, and other observations. And just finished talking about these collateral contacts. Okay, all of these are important. And if from your findings that you identify a possible mental disorder or a problem that you feel like needs to be taken a step further, talk with your supervisor, again, your mental health specialist, or the clinician, the mental health provider in your district for a possible diagnosis. Again, we're talking about identification today, and we're not necessarily the ones that make that diagnosis. We refer that to the professionals. And we'll talk more next week about how to actually do that. Okay, if it turns out that that person does have a mental disorder, you send them to the clinician, they come back and they do have a mental disorder, then we need to talk about conditions of supervision. And for that section, I'm going to ask Tom to discuss that.
Thank you, Mark. Let's talk about when to recommend a mental health condition and how to word it. First of all, Is a mental health condition necessary in each and every case where there's a mental health disorder? No, it's not. It's not the presence of a mental health disorder. Rather, there's several factors that we want to consider in determining whether to recommend one. Let's take 1 minute and we'll go to page 27 in your program guide, and let's identify at least 3 factors that you would want to consider. Write them down and we'll be back. Welcome back. And here's the 3 that we came up with. First, severity of disorder. The person has been evaluated by a psychologist or psychiatrist, and based upon their diagnosis and treatment prognosis, the disorder will create a problem for managing risk or compliance. Second, the risk level. The disorder creates a risk level, either risk of flight or danger to the community. We need to also look sometimes at personality disorders. Though you want this assessed, this is not amenable to treatment, and you might have to manage this by other supervision conditions, such as limitations on travel or contact with certain individuals. And 3, if treatment is required, you need to assess someone's willingness and ability to participate in treatment. A couple of words about that. We will have individuals that suffer maybe marital problems, anxiety or depression, and voluntarily seek treatment. You are then, the officer is frequently satisfied that the mental health treatment condition has been addressed. Other more serious disorders, such as schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder, require a condition regardless of the person's willingness to cooperate. If a mental health treatment condition is needed, you want to impose that for a specific reason. If you think the person presents a risk, you need to specify what that risk is. We're going to put a list together in a few minutes that will serve as a set of guidelines that you can use during your investigation and supervision to determine when a mental health treatment condition is warranted. You might look at someone that has a history of relapse, not taking their medication, discharging from psychiatric hospitals against medical advice. Right now, let's take 2 minutes and, with a partner, generate as many reasons as you can think for putting together a mental health condition, okay? Let's take 2 minutes to do this. Welcome back, and here's the list that we came up with. Number one, a person has a history of relapse due to not taking their medication or not following through on prescribed treatment. Two, they refuse voluntary participation, though they've been diagnosed with a mental health disorder. Three, they're in treatment but resistant to treatment. They're either not showing up for appointments, they're not taking medication. They have a prior history of violence or aggressive acts. They have a mental disorder that could indicate a degree of impulsiveness, such as an antisocial personality disorder. Number five, there's violence associated with the offense. By that we would mean any sex offense, stalking, assault to a public official. And finally, they're motivated for treatment, but they need financial assistance to pay for it. As you are aware, for the either pretrial services or probation to pay for mental health treatment, there must be a court order specifying such. Let's determine some special conditions, and we've got an exercise for you with that. We've got 3 case studies. We're going to look at them so you could practice applying the guidelines as to when to recommend a mental health treatment condition. And please consult pages 30 through 32 in your program guide. Case number 1 is for pretrial services, pre-sentence writers. Case number 2 is for pretrial services officers only. And case number 3 is for all the officers. So what I'd like you to do is let's take 1 minute to organize ourselves into groups of 3 or 4. We're back again. Let's select a case study and read through it. Identify the supervision issues and risks posed by the individuals. And let's determine what special conditions are needed. Once again, working in groups of 3 or 4, select one of the case studies to discuss, identify supervision issues, and we're going to give you 8 minutes for this. See you in a bit. Welcome back. Here's what the Planning Committee came up with, and you might want to record the Planning Committee's conditions below the description of each case in your guide, which again, they're on pages 30 to 32. So why don't we each take 3 minutes and we'll read all 3 cases so we're familiar with them. See you in a minute. And welcome back again. For case number 1, the Planning Committee had these recommendations. Therapy and medication, a condition that includes for the individual because of their diagnosed mental health disorder, history of relapse due to drug abuse, violent behavior that threats and stalking and the purchase of firearms, and the fact that he periodically stops taking his medication. The second condition was the stalking and threatening behavior could require hospitalization or commitment to a halfway house where the behavior could be monitored. And there were also considerations for restrictions on his movement so he would not have the access to the judge, attorney, or ex-wife. With regard to the second case, we believe, the committee believes this is indicative of a antisocial personality disorder, and hence no mental health condition is needed. This will be a challenging case, but interventions might include conditions that would restrict the person's access to various things, travel. And with regard to number 3, our recommendations were this warrants a mental health treatment condition that includes therapy and possible medication for depression, and the person's unstable behavior and possible suicide attempt may warrant temporary placement in a halfway house to monitor the behavior and help her function. Before we move on, something we need to consider. Individuals with a mental health disorder can benefit from treatment conditions such as full employment or community service. Indeed, the community might also benefit from such. What we need to consider is the severity of the disorder and the risk that the person places to the community. Before you recommend such conditions, you might want to consult with your mental health specialist. The severity of the disorder and the risk the person poses to the community need also to be taken into consideration as it pertains to violations. A person's lack of compliance might not be due to the fact of resistance, but rather the nature and the severity of their disorder. For instance, if you have a person with a condition of full employment and they can't follow through on that, you might A, petition the court to have this condition removed, or B, amend it so that the person participate in some type of job training. We've decided now on the treatment conditions or set of conditions, and our next step is we're going to look at how to word them. All right? In your participant guide on page 33, we'll note 2 examples of mental health treatment conditions, and let's look at the first one. The individual shall participate